Okay, we started in this very controversial, perhaps the most controversial, difficult topic in the Bible, really, last week, and that is the conquest of Canaan. And we've got to Numbers 31, which is the first sort of one of those passages that is tough to read in our without sort of the background information that we're working on. But one example, and we read a bunch of them last week, but the last one we read, 1 Samuel 22:19, it says, Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword, both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep, he put to the sword. And we have these sort of commands in Deuteronomy and in Joshua and 1 Samuel. These were referred to as the Haram commands, or the total destruction commands, to kill everything that breathes. We see it in 1 Samuel as well, with Saul and the Amalekites. It's a common thing. So we talked about how these, that's what the HRM is there, Jacady. It's not about human resources, so you don't have to leave. But it's often referred to as the Yahweh wars, or the wars that God commands in some sense. Okay, so we've been talking about that. It's one of the main things our culture is uncomfortable with about the Bible. One of the main things you'll hear brought up if you talk to people who are not Christians, who have figured out ways to attack Christians, are these things. So we read a bunch of those passages last week, and what we wanted to do is lay out some ways to help us think about these things before we get into them, starting in Numbers 31. Firstly, we said that they are creator-initiated, and that's sort of the idea of the prerogative of the creator. That is, basically, God can do what he wants to do. That's part A. But along with that, it's that every death is in the hand of God. That no death is outside of God's hand. Matthew 6, not one sparrow falls from the sky outside of the hand of the Father. So every death, not just the ones in sort of cataclysmic events, every death is in some sense in the hand of God. Tornadoes that come through our cities, the flood in Genesis 6, for goodness sakes, all these are God having control over life and death. If something keeps breathing, it's because God gives it another breath. And if it stops breathing, it's because God took it away. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Who am I to answer back to my Creator? Job 37, Romans 9, and say to my Creator, why have you made me like this? All these things. Okay, that was our basic idea here. We also said this event was unique. It wasn't like Israel just did this all the time, or there's something they could just do. In fact, one time they tried to take up their own mantle and go fight in the name of the Lord when God didn't command them to, even brought the Ark of the Covenant with them, and they lost because God didn't command them to do it. So it wasn't that Israel had some sort of ability and power to supersede morality. It was that God commanded, and therefore it was right. And this is the one time he does that, or the one conquering that occurs in the Bible. It's a unique situation with the land, a unique people, a unique enemy, all those things. We said secondly or thirdly that it was not arbitrary. That is, God didn't just say, well, we're going to kill the Canaanites now. It was that these people were evil, and their evil had been stored up for 400 years. He tells Abraham, it's not time for you to go into Canaan yet, because the people who are there have not yet stored up their sin. Their sin has not been filled up. When God wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah, it's because their time had come. There weren't 10 righteous in that city. When God sent the flood on the earth and killed however many people were alive, he did so because the time was then, that the world had become evil and entirely evil. That's what it says in Genesis 6, right? All their thoughts were just evil continually. And when the time came that was the case, judgment came. Same with Sodom and Gomorrah, same with Canaan. And we know because it didn't happen already with Abraham that God waited until that time had come. We said last week, who knows how many good people, even God-fearing people, lived in that 400-year period up until it became utterly evil and ready for destruction. So it wasn't arbitrary. It was God planned, and it was because of their evil. We know that they were taking part in child sacrifice, in incest, in rampant adultery, in temple sex, temple homosexuality, and for these reasons, God comes in judgment. We also said that the Bible talks about how these people were worshiping demons. Okay, I made the point that it seems obvious to me that all these pagan religions, which seem to have a lot of things in common, like child sacrifice, is a very common thing across religions, across continents. Right? We know of South American tribes, and we know of African tribes, and we know of Asian tribes that practice child sacrifice, and there's no connection in any of them. It's almost as if there is a connection. And that's the spiritual world and what's leading them all. So, and the Bible is explicit about that, right? We looked at a few passages last week about saying that they were offering to demons or they were offering to the devil. And we talked about that the principle in the Bible of worship is you begin to look like that which you worship, right? Which is awesome for the Christian because we begin to look like Jesus. We begin to look more peaceful and more patient and more kind and more good and more loving and more holy. But for those who are worshiping demons, they begin to look more like the devil and doing things like child sacrifice and all these things. And so it wasn't that these people were just innocents hanging out and then God showed up out of nowhere. They had reached the utter extremity of evil. We said, last thing we said last week was it wasn't because they didn't worship Yahweh. If you read Amos 1 and 2, it's explicit there as well. It wasn't precisely because they didn't worship Yahweh. It's because they were evil. And it wasn't just because that they called the God something else. It was that they were evil, and that they were rampantly evil, and that they were even worshiping demons. Okay, the next one for today, and I'm going to have to start over after this one, is that it was not ethnic. It was not ethnic. Obviously, in our modern world, the idea of ethnocentricity or racism is very hot topics, very, very. We raise them to the highest degree as if they're controlling everything in the world. And so it's commonplace for someone to say, well, God is racist because he preferred one people over the other. But if you've read any of the Bible, certainly any of what we've read to this point, you can't come away with that conclusion. From the very beginning, you realize that God is not about Israel, but about all nations. The promise in Genesis 12, which starts the story in the real sense, post-creation and all those things. The promise is that God will bless all nations through Abraham, but all nations are the end result. All nations being blessed is the gospel. Paul says that God preached the gospel to Abraham when he told him, in you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. It was always about all nations. We've already seen in Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, that there's lots of positive things about foreigners, lots of good foreign leaders. We mentioned this, we often pass over it. It says a mixed multitude left Egypt with Moses. So it wasn't just Israelites that left Egypt. Egyptians left Egypt with them, saying, well, that God seems to be the right one. Let's go with him. There was a mixed multitude left Egypt. Moses married a dark-skinned Ethiopian. In Joshua chapter 6, Rahab, who's a Canaanite, becomes part of the people of God. In Joshua chapter 7, Achan, who's an Israelite, gets kicked out of the people of God. Because it's not about your ethnicity. It's about how you respond to God. It's about you looking to the God of creation, or you not looking to him. It's the whole, repeated over and over in the New Testament, that it is not Jew or Gentile, right? The Romans 1 through 3, that's the whole message. It's not about Jew or Gentile. We're all guilty in front of God. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All those things. Also, throughout the Old Testament, we have lots of concern for non-Israelites, which is it's not only rare, it's unheard of in the ancient world for people to look after the foreigner in the way the Israelite was called to. They were commanded to take care of the sojourner, to take care of the foreigner. He says, Leviticus 19:34, love the foreigner as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I'm the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 10, God loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Therefore, you love the sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Israel. Incredibly, the sojourner had the same legal rights in Israel as the Jew. That was unheard of until Christianity had taken over in Rome. Right? No one did that. Where if you were a foreigner, you had the same legal rights in the nation of the people that were there. That was already the case, Leviticus 24:22. They could participate in Passover, in the feast with the Jews, if you were a foreigner. The only negative stuff about foreign people was about foreign religions. That's always the focus. It was not, don't be a Canaanite. It's, don't worship the gods of the Canaanites. Don't do the things the Canaanites are doing in response to their gods. In Matthew 15, a Canaanite woman comes to Jesus asking for Jesus to heal her daughter. And Jesus says, woman, great is your faith. Be it done as your desire. This Canaanite woman. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 7. Just as an example of this. So, it was about Canaanite religion more than it was about the Canaanite people. That was always the focus, about getting rid of Canaanite religion more than Canaanite people. Deuteronomy 7. Verse 5. Thus you shall deal with them, that is the Canaanites. You shall break down their altars, their worship places. You shall dash in pieces their pillars and chop down their Asherim, and burn their carved images with fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 12. Okay, so he says, here's how you'll deal with the Canaanites. By the way, it doesn't just say we're going to kill them all, because they don't, but he says you're going to destroy their religious things. You're going to destroy their religion. Deuteronomy 12, verse 2. You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess, the Canaanites, serve their gods. On the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree, you shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods and destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, etc. We have that sort of language over and over about the destruction of Canaan. That we're going in not because of the Canaanites themselves, as much as we're going in about Canaanite religion. That is what we're fearful of. We're fearful of their religion. Fearful of the Canaanite religion. Okay. And then we know it's not ethnic because this word haram, that which is translated total destruction, utter destruction, something like that, is also spoken of about Israel, where God says, if you stop following me, I will haram you, that you will be utterly destroyed. So it was never about God's Israel versus everyone else. It was those who follow God and those who don't. And utter destruction is promised to all those who are evil, who worship the devil instead of God. Okay? Thoughts on that? I'm not looking, so just speak up if you got anything. Anything at all? Okay. Next one. The Canaanites weren't ignorant. They weren't ignorant about God. We know that just from some biblical principles, right? Romans chapter 1 says everyone is without excuse. Everyone knows that there is a creator God, that God exists. Has no excuse for saying that God doesn't exist or not seeing God. Romans 2 says everyone has in them a moral law that says certain things are right and certain things are wrong and are responsible to respond appropriately to that inside of us that God has put as part of that imago Dei, part of that image of God. So special revelation, which is the Bible, things like that, God's speaking, isn't necessary to orient yourself properly to God. God holds these nations accountable first for their evil because they should know better. You can turn if you want, but you can just listen to me read it. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31 says, by faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient. Right? So the people in Canaan were not just ignorant people just doing what they knew best. They were people who knew what to do and were disobedient to what they should have known, to what they should have done. They weren't ignorant. They knew, and more precisely, look at Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2. Verse 9. Joshua chapter 2, verse 9. This is Rahab speaking. So Rahab being a Canaanite woman who lived in Jericho, lived in Canaan. Here's what she says, verse 9. She said to the men, I know that Yahweh has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. As soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you, for Yahweh, the Lord your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Now, the Israelites didn't come in and start preaching the message about God. She knew those things. How could word not get out if what Exodus talks about happened? And she says, of course we knew. I mean, the things she says about your God, I know the Lord has given you the land. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea, brought you out of Egypt, destroyed these other kings. Okay, so the people in Canaan weren't just sitting around and were shocked, hey, there's some people outside, they call themselves Israel or something. They knew about it all. They knew they were on their way. They knew the path they were taking. They knew they crossed the Red Sea, they defeated Egypt, that God was with them. Rahab responded appropriately to that God and was saved. And anyone else who would have done so would have been saved as well. Anyone else who did so was saved as well. Rahab is proof that there wasn't a call to destruction without exception. Also, by the way, the first battle was in the walls, the Battle of Jericho. They marched around the walls 7 times. You don't think they knew what was coming? Every marching around the walls was them saying, get out of Dodge. Here's another chance. Try again tomorrow. Here's another chance. They knew they were coming. They knew what was coming. They knew about the God. There wasn't ignorance there. Okay, now, probably the most important point to remember about this, if you remember nothing else, if you're on an elevator and someone says, hey, you're a Christian, what about Canaan? This is where you go. Okay, this is the crucial point, in my opinion, and that is so much hyperbole. So much hyperbole. What's hyperbole mean, Chance? Yeah, exaggeration, and like extreme exaggeration. So much hyperbole. And what I mean is, this is the way they talked about battle in the ancient Mesopotamian Near East. This is all the accounts we have about battle are spoken of this way. We're going to destroy everything. We're going to kill all women and children. We're going to kill everything that breathes. Nothing will survive. The problem is, it's not a problem, it's great, but the problem with how it affects us when we read this modernly is, we read, for instance, in the beginning of Joshua, that Joshua destroyed everything that breathes. No Canaanite was left. And then the whole rest of the book is filled with Canaanites, all throughout the cities of Canaan. We find in the New Testament a Canaanite woman coming to Jesus. Weren't they wiped out by Joshua just a millennium ago? Why are there still Canaanites? There are still Canaanites. So whatever was meant by Joshua when he said, I followed God's command to totally destroy, and I did it. That's look at Joshua 10. Joshua 10, verse 40. So Joshua struck the whole land, the hill country, and the Negeb, and the lowland, and the slopes, and all their kings. He left none remaining, but devoted to destruction all that breathed, just as the Lord of God of Israel commanded. And Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea as far as Gaza, etc., etc. Destroyed everything, utterly destroyed. Because the Lord of God, our God, had fought for Israel. The rest of Joshua, we have them dealing with the returning Canaanites. Look at the next book. Look at Judges chapter 1. Judges chapter 1, verse 21. The people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the Jebusites, the Canaanites. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Look at verse 27. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. This is after Joshua has utterly destroyed Canaan. There's Canaanites everywhere. We got all kinds of Canaanites that they didn't drive out, and they're still with them to this day, the author writes. Still with them to this day. Look at Joshua chapter 11. Joshua chapter 11. Here's the basic case I'm making as we're looking at these things. It's obviously it's a pedantic version of it, but it's similar to us to a high school sports team saying we destroyed Alexandria yesterday. If someone read that in 1,000 years, they'd be like, "Wow, brutal," right? But we know what's meant, right? And they knew what was meant too. They meant they won. It was utter victory. Even when it talks about killing all women and children, which we'll look at a little closely in a moment. Even that is used in those languages just to mean it just means all. Okay, it just seems to mean we killed out. We had utter victory. We had utter victory. We destroyed everything. We had utter victory. Look at Joshua 11, verse 21. Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Dibber, and from the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction. Joshua haram them. That is Anakim. the Anakim. Verse 22, there was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza and Gath and Ashdod did some remain. So none in Canaan, no more Anakim, because Joshua destroyed them all. So Joshua took the whole land, according to all the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel. Look at three chapters later, chapter 14. Verse 12. Okay, so all the Anakim destroyed, no more Anakim in Canaan. Verse 12. So now give me this hill country, of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there, with great fortified cities. And maybe the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out, just as the Lord said. Drive who out? The Anakim, who supposedly were driven out 3 chapters earlier. Do we think the author forgot? Right? Is that what we think? The author forgot that he had written that a minute ago? Written that. I like written better. Do we think the author forgot that he wrote that a moment ago, that the Anakim were not there anymore? No, of course not. It's just that hyperbolic language is common in this war-type language, and he uses it there. We destroyed the Amalekites. We destroyed the Ammonites. We destroyed them. And then we hung out with them a couple of chapters later. It's the way they spoke, this hyperbolic way of speaking. Look at Joshua 11, verse 23, with the focus on the land. Okay, so you already heard a little bit. It says over and over, Joshua took all the land of Canaan. Took all the land. Joshua 11, verse 23. Joshua took the whole land, according to all the Lord had spoken to Moses. Right, so all that he promised, Joshua took it all. Look at chapter 13, verse 1. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, you're old and advanced in years. That's great. And there remains yet very much land to possess. Right? 2 chapters later. So Joshua took the whole land. 2 chapters later. A lot of land you hadn't taken yet, Joshua. We still got to go get. Okay, so it's just this hyperbolic language. Look at one more example. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 7. It's also the case with the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15. Saul, you remember this whole, which we'll get to eventually. Saul is commanded to haram the Amalekites. And he does, except for the cattle. Right? He utterly destroys the Amalekites. But then the Amalekites are appearing throughout the rest of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 27, David is with the Amalekites. 1 Samuel 30, the Amalekites made a raid. So we see that sort of thing throughout the Bible. Okay, Deuteronomy 7, verse 2. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, you must devote them to complete destruction. You must devote them to complete destruction. That's haram. You shall make no covenant with them and shall show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them. Hold on a second. Here's command 1. Command 1 is utterly destroy them. It's the same. Nothing left breathing. Command 2 is, and then don't marry their daughters. Right? Who are we marrying? Right? Who's left to marry? Why the command needed for the second part? Why the commands for not following their gods? Because they're still there. Because what's not being talked about is a genocide of all people of a race. It's talking about winning the battle, of achieving the goal of the battle, of taking back the land, which is the goal. Okay, thoughts on that? Thoughts on that? We're making good time. No thoughts, man. I must be killing it. Okay. Next is what I'm just going to call military encampments. Military encampments. Here's the point. From everything we can tell, never said this explicitly, from everything we can tell, they were attacking military bases, not civilian cities. Here's what I mean. We have no archaeological evidence that anyone outside of the military ever lived in Jericho. We know where Jericho is, by the way. We know all about Jericho archaeologically, real city. Everything in that city points to it being military. That it was a military encampment, that there weren't even women and children there. Same thing with Ai, which is the next battle, the 2 most famous battles in going into Canaan. What it seems like, which is what makes sense, is that they were going to battle with the strongholds of Canaan, and there weren't any infants in the stronghold. Okay, so again, you get sort of that hyperbolic language. That's part A. Part B with it is, even if there were women and children in this city, we know through Rahab and others that they knew they were coming a long way away. Anytime you read ancient battle stories, think about it today. If we knew today armies are coming into Ohatchee, they'll be here in a week. We just hanging out with our women and children? Like we just chilling till they get here? Would they have been doing that? Would they have say, yeah, I know they're coming. I know God just destroyed Egypt, which is stronger than us, but we're going to stay here with our kids. Of course not. They're getting out of Dodge. You read the accounts about ancient battles like Troy in Greece and the underground caves that people would escape through. That was historically accurate. They had escape routes for the women and children, for the innocents when there was battles. So even if there were people there, to think they were still there when they knew Israel was coming is a stretch, to put it kindly. But we have all these kill all men and women, kill all women and children, all everything. But the idea seems to be that he's saying kill everything, that is, have utter destruction, win the battle. Right? We know it doesn't mean kill everything. It means win the battle convincingly, utterly. And on top of that, it doesn't seem that there's any women and children at the places they were attacking. The fight, people that had committed the fight, people that were part of the army, attacks on military forts. The language doesn't require women and children to be there. It's the hyperbolic language of winning, and winning convincingly and utterly. And then the marching around Jericho 7 times thing doesn't help. Like you're just hanging out in there with your babies and their army's marching around Jericho and you're like, let's just see what happens. All right. Now, if you're thinking along with me, then maybe you think, okay, well, what about Rahab? Rahab was a woman. Rahab was in Jericho. Say again. Making money she was. Yeah, this is actually it was a common thing for in military encampments for them to have taverns that were run by females. Okay, that's not odd. We know that outside of the Bible, that there were taverns run by females. On top of that, Fortress Tavern, that is where travelers would stay. That is where foreigners would go. They would go to the tavern. It was it would be like hotel-like. They would stay in that place. All that seems to fit, seems to make sense to the story of Rahab. For instance, from the Code of Hammurabi, which is obviously not Israel, biblical, says, if conspirators meet in the house of the female tavern keeper and they're not captured and delivered, she shall be put to death. Right, so they would have known about that code. That fits well into the narrative of how it's written about Rahab, that she was risking her life to keep them there. The Code of Hammurabi, which is the biggest code that we can find about moral things of ancient Mesopotamian world, says if the female tavern keeper hides people, she's to be killed. That's exactly what seems to be happening in the story with Rahab. It makes much more sense to me that Jericho, and again, archaeological evidence all points this way, that Jericho was a military encampment that they were attacking. Ai, same thing. That they didn't attack civilian places, and so obviously there's Canaanites left everywhere. There's no command to kill the non-combatants. There's no command, hey, if someone's running away, chase them down. It was just, we're going into this land, and whoever fights for the land against our God will be killed. We're taking the land. It's not about genociding the people. And that's the final point is it the final? Okay, well, it's kind of the final. It's also kind of not. It's how I roll. But this one is just that. It's about the land. It's about the land. The conquest of Canaan was not about conquesting the Canaanites. It was about conquesting the land that God had promised. We get the language, more often than anything, the language about the conquest of Canaan is that they're going to drive them out. They're going to dispossess them of the land. Look at Exodus 23. Exodus 23, one of the first times we hear about this thing. Exodus 23. Still about the land. That's right, yeah. Yeah, welcome to the modern political landscape. Exodus 23. Mm-hmm. 27. I will send my 23:27. I will send my terror before you and throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come, and I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you, which means to run away. I'll make them turn their backs to you. Verse 28. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, the Hittites from before you. I will drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little, I will drive them out. right? That's the promise. God could have just killed all the Canaanites, right? He could have done that, but he doesn't do that. He is driving them out of the land. Anyone who stayed and fought to keep the land would be fought. But anyone who just left the land was not fought, was not pursued, was not chased down, because the land was what they were coming to get. Flip to Numbers to the right. Numbers chapter 21. Verse 32. Says, and Moses sent to spy out Jazer, and they captured its villages and dispossessed the Amorites who were there. They dispossessed the Amorites. Some more verses. Deuteronomy 9:1. Hear, O Israel, you are to go in to dispossess nations greater than you. Deuteronomy 11. The Lord will drive out these nations before you. You will dispossess these nations greater and mightier than you. Deuteronomy 18. These nations which you are about to dispossess, to take away what they possess. Deuteronomy 19, verse 1. When the Lord God cuts off the nations the Lord is giving you, you dispossess them and dwell in their cities. It's the same word used about God driving Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, right? It's the idea of them being driven out of the land, so that the Israelites may possess the land. It was always about this land promised to Abraham. It's called driving out and dispossessing much more than it's called destroying. And even when destroying is used, this seems to be in mind. Look at Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy 28. Verse 63. As the Lord took delight in doing you good and multiplying you, so the Lord will take delight in bringing ruin upon you and destroying you, and you shall be plucked off the land that you are entering to take possession of it. To take possession of that land. Okay, so no fleer was pursued, only the resistance, the combatants were fought. Yeah, okay, that's good. Thoughts on those things? Go.
So even if it was genocide, I mean, the flood happened in
Right.
genocide.
Right. Yeah, so chance that even if it is genocide, we've already kind of had that with the flood, right? You already got to deal with that problem. I fully agree, right? If that's all we're thinking about, the flood is harder. We have Genesis 6 where he said all the thoughts are evil continually, but surely there were children alive, right? So we've already, if you're reading the Old Testament and you're thinking, you've already had to come to grips with the fact that God can do what he wants with life. The harder thing about the Canaanite thing in my mind is that God commands people to do it, right? He commands people to go in and do it, right? Which makes it more difficult because it's not just God directly acting, right? No one really has an issue with Sodom and Gomorrah. God just acting and as his role as creator. What seems to make the Canaanite thing a little more testy is that he's commanding people to do that, now, which he does throughout the Bible, but obviously it gets explicit and makes us uncomfortable in that way. That they're told to go in and do these things. Because you read the passages, and the picture you get is Israelites going in with swords and killing babies. And that's the picture you get when you read and you're thinking, I can't get behind that, right? Like that's really hard for me. That's whether we want. It's a different thing commanding humans to do it than God doing it himself. Right? There is some distinction to be made there. But I agree. I mean, that's a great point. That if you're going to deal with history at all and believe that God is sovereign, you got to be okay with God allowing death, to use the passive term, right? That every death God could stop. And obviously, more strongly, God sent a flood and kills everything on earth. Okay, yeah. Any more thoughts on that? All right, let me finish with kind of two less pointed points, but true ones. Canaanites join, of course, in the promise for all nations, and Canaanites are grafted into redemption. Christ died for the Canaanites like he died for everyone else. When it says in Revelation that all tribes, nations, and tongues will be singing to God, Canaan is one of them. There are people that were saved by Christ in Canaan. Galatians 3, of course, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female, all are one in Christ Jesus. Psalm 87, the psalmist says, there will be the Egyptian and the Babylonian, the Philistine and the Tyre, those of Canaan worshiping together in the city of Jerusalem. Isaiah 19, in that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. Assyria will be with Egypt. Egypt will be with Assyria. Egypt will worship with the Assyrians. In that day Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth. Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. The plan has always been all nations together worshiping God, and that plan will be successful. Of course, in Matthew 15, again, the Canaanite woman comes to Jesus, and this Canaanite woman is told by Jesus she has great faith. And then finally, which we said a little bit at the beginning, is that God has proved himself trustworthy. Certainly on this side of the cross, God has proved himself trustworthy. And if you, for your friends, for your mistake-riddled, sin-riddled, fallible friends, give them the benefit of the doubt when they do something out of character, surely you would give God the benefit of the doubt with something that seems to you to be out of character. Right? If someone came up to me and said, hey, I don't know if you know this, but Cam punched a girl last night, I'd be like, I just that doesn't seem like Cam to me. I'm going to talk to Cam first. And I'm not going to think Cam punched a girl. Right? My mind would probably say, well, he probably went after a guy and then a girl got in the way. Something like that. I'm going to make the benefit of the doubt for Cam because I know Cam and I trust Cam and I know his character and I know it's not in his character to hit a woman. Surely God, who is better than Cam and perfect and showed his love for all of us and his mercy and his grace constantly, surely God has earned at least that sort of benefit of the doubt. When you read a passage that is difficult and that seems out of the character of the God that you know, to say, I don't know what it is, but I know God. I know the God that is. And to give him that sort of thing as you would to a friend. Surely God's worthy of the same.